Many of the companies, civic institutions, and wealthy donors supporting the bid had made six-figure financial contributions to the effort, fueling a campaign that by January 2015 already had spent more than $10 million on staff salaries, communications and political consultants, Class A office space, and design and planning services. About 100 yards down Beacon Street from the State House, a small team of volunteers opposed to Boston 2024's Olympic bid huddled around laptops in a cramped, crowded conference room in temporary makeshift headquarters. Boston's Olympic boosters had dismissed the group known as No Boston Olympics in bid documents submitted privately to the USOC. So they actually talked about us in this bid document and talked about how insignificant we were.
Tonight I'm thrilled to introduce Chris Dempsey. Chris is a Brookline native and, having grown up on the Green Line, is currently the Director of Transportation for Massachusetts, a nonprofit coalition of 50 organizations focused on transportation policy. 2 years ago, as he details in his book, No Boston Olympics, Chris led the effort to bar Boston City officials' bid to host the 2024 Summer Olympics here. Tonight he will tell us about that process and how others can protect their city's best interests by doing the same. Please join me in welcoming Chris Dempsey.
Thanks, Carrie. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for being here tonight. I forgot that my parents have so many friends. So
do you.
But I'm really honored that you'd all be here, and it's such a great hometown welcoming for me. I still live about 3 blocks down the street in Brookline Village. So great to be able to walk home from an event like this. We'll talk a little bit today about the history of Boston 2024, kind of remind you what it was all about, remind you why there were a lot of myths around Boston 2024, or misconceptions or misstatements around Boston 2024, and then talk a little bit about why we chose to write about the book, why we think that the story of Boston 2024 is important to other cities and other communities that are considering their Olympic bids. So here's some of the folks behind Boston 2024. You'll recognize the man in the middle. That's former Governor Mitt Romney, who was a big supporter of Boston 2024. On the left is John Fish, who is the owner of Civic Construction, the largest construction company in Massachusetts, and named by Boston Magazine as the most powerful person in Boston. And on the right is Steve Pagliuca, who is the co-owner of the Boston Celtics, also the father of a good friend of mine from business school. So folks like this got together and they decided that the Olympics would be a great thing for Boston and for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And here's the vision that they presented. And this is a pretty compelling vision. I mean, look at our beautiful city with that gleaming skyline in the background and the harbor. I think you can actually see some tall ships here. So they were thinking through that. And we've got these great fireworks going off. And you can imagine billions of eyeballs around the world watching television, watching our beautiful city on the world stage. And frankly, there's a lot to like about that. That's a very appealing concept to think of our great city on the world stage. But remember this image because we're going to look at it in the context of other cities. So they put together this bid, and over the course of 2013 and 2014, they pitched it to the United States Olympic Committee. And this is actually Mayor Walsh giving the final presentation along with John Fish, along with David Manfredi, who's a prominent architect in town, giving the final pitch about why the United States Olympic Committee should choose Boston 2024, why we were a better host than Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., or San Francisco, which were all producing their own bids. But there were some real challenges with the work that they did to pull this bid together. And one of them is that they chose to develop the bid without any public input. In fact, the bid was kept secret from the public over the course of all of 2013 and 2014. And that meant that the USOC and people related to Boston 2024, they could read the bid. In fact, this is literally the bid book, right? Sitting on the table. And the United States Olympic Committee, which is composed of a bunch of business executives and former athletes and others that are associated with the Olympics, they could read about what the Olympics would mean for Boston. They could read about the budget, but regular Bostonians couldn't, and the press couldn't. That was kept secret from the press, and they made the case that it had to be secret because they didn't want to get into a bidding war. But of course, you inevitably get into a bidding war, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this was the secret bid book. And one of the problems when you plan things in secret is that you end up making some pretty poor decisions. For example, they had in the bid book that the country club in Brookline was going to be the host of golf. But because it was secret, they didn't tell any members of the Board of Selectmen or the town manager or anyone else that was living in Brookline that this was an event that might come to Brookline in 2024. So you get these sort of weird outcomes and these mismatches of information. But nonetheless, because of their success in pitching the bid to the United States Olympic Committee, they chose Boston, the USOC chose Boston, or Boston 2024, over these other bids. Now this is the dynamic that we had with Boston 2024 versus no Boston Olympics. We formed in a living room, and I'll talk more about that, in the winter of 2013. Our entire budget was less than $10,000. Boston 2024 spent $15 million, funded largely by people like John Fish and Steve Pagliuca and Mitt Romney. So with that context, I want to read an introductory part of the book that talks about the lead up to this day, and this day where the front page of the Boston Globe is about the USOC choosing Boston 2024 over these other cities. Many of the companies, civic institutions, and wealthy donors supporting the bid had made six-figure financial contributions to the effort, fueling a campaign that by January 2015 already had spent more than $10 million on staff salaries, communications and political consultants, Class A office space, and design and planning services. About 100 yards down Beacon Street from the State House, a small team of volunteers opposed to Boston 2024's Olympic bid huddled around laptops in a cramped, crowded conference room in temporary makeshift headquarters. Boston's Olympic boosters had dismissed the group known as No Boston Olympics in bid documents submitted privately to the USOC. So they actually talked about us in this bid document and talked about how insignificant we were. Thursday, January 8th, 2015 was a dry but bitterly cold day in New England. The winter wind whipped among the brick and granite civic and commercial buildings massed on Boston's Beacon Hill, prodding the familiar collection of legislators, lobbyists, and bureaucrats to dart quickly from automobiles and subway headhouses to their offices and appointments. At noon, under the golden dome of the centuries-old State House at the very top of the hill, businessman and former state budget chief Charlie Baker was inaugurated as Massachusetts' 72nd governor, the victor 2 months prior in a hard-fought election against the state's Attorney General, Martha Coakley. Baker was a Republican in a Democratic state. His margin of victory had been just 40,000 votes out of more than 2 million cast, the Commonwealth's closest gubernatorial race in 50 years. In his inaugural address, Baker pledged to set aside partisanship, make government more efficient, improve transparency and accountability, and work always in the public interest. It would take monumental news to push the inauguration and the new governor's first words from above the fold of the front page of Friday's Boston Globe. But the results of a secretive, closed-door meeting in a conference room at Denver International Airport would do just that. At 6:29 p.m. Eastern Time, the Twitter account of the United States Olympic Committee declared that the USOC's board of directors had chosen a bid from Boston as the official U.S. bid for the 2024 Olympics. The USOC's board, composed largely of former Olympic athletes and business executives with ties to Olympic sponsors, had voted for an underdog bid from Boston over alternatives from Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and the favorite and two-time Olympic host, Los Angeles. Once the decision had been made and the news had been shared with the world, USOC Chairman Larry Probst, CEO Scott Blackman, and other USOC staff immediately boarded a plane for Boston's Logan Airport. A press conference was scheduled for early Friday morning at the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center in the city's fast-growing Seaport district. That massive 2.1 million square foot convention center also happened to be the site of Governor Baker's inaugural ball on Thursday evening. And attendees were buzzing with news that the Olympic rings might come to Massachusetts. Within hours of the USOC's announcement, Boston 2024, the private group organizing the Olympic bid, convened a congratulatory and euphoric conference call for its lengthy roster of business, political, and institutional supporters. Now, we know about this call because someone gave us the phone number for it, so I was actually listening in while this call occurred. Boston 2024's boosters included many of Greater Boston's largest corporations, 6 of the city's 10 most powerful individuals, according to the annual ranking by Boston Magazine, and the city's popular new mayor, Marty Walsh, who had given the bid his enthusiastic backing. Many of the companies, civic institutions, and wealthy donors supporting the bid had made 6-figure financial contributions to the effort, fueling a campaign that by January 2015 already had spent more than $10 million on staff salaries, communications and political consultants, Class A office space, and design and planning services. About 100 yards down Beacon Street from the State House, a small team of volunteers opposed to Boston 2024's Olympic bid huddled around laptops in a cramped, crowded conference room in temporary makeshift headquarters. Boston's Olympic boosters had dismissed the group known as No Boston Olympics in bid documents submitted privately to the USOC. So they actually talked about us in this bid document and talked about how insignificant we were. Here's the quote. Polling data shows that they do not represent the majority of public opinion. No elected official has publicly endorsed the group. They have not received significant financial backing, and their efforts have been limited to social media. And that wasn't an entirely unfair description. Although the group had been founded more than a year earlier, No Boston Olympics had raised less than $5,000 to Boston 2024's $10 million, and could point to only a handful of sympathetic elected officials. Just 1 month prior, one of its 3 co-founders had publicly and conspicuously flipped sides to become a backer of the bid. And polling done by local media outlets showed that most voters in Boston, and in Massachusetts more broadly, supported the idea of a Boston Olympics. And while the group's efforts might have extended beyond just social media, No Boston Olympics hadn't yet held a single organizing meeting, nor did it have full-time staff, office space, or even a post office box to receive mailed contributions. Exactly 200 days after that cold winter evening, when the USOC's choice of Boston pushed Governor Baker's inauguration from the headlines, Boston 2024 and the USOC jointly terminated the bid in the face of public and organized opposition that USOC Chairman Larry Probst would later call unprecedented for an American city. The narrative that follows explains how No Boston Olympics and allied groups mobilized that public opposition, forever changing the course of Boston's history and dealing a shocking defeat to Boston 2024's boosters, the USOC, and the International Olympic Committee. Thank you. So before taking questions, I want to do 2 more things quickly. One is I want to talk about some of those myths about Boston 2024, talk about how we deconstructed the bid and were able to show that there were significant drawbacks and not just benefits. And the second thing I want to do is, again, put Boston in context of other cities that have said no. So here's 10 myths about Boston 2024. This one is very important to me personally as a lifelong Bostonian who's never owned a car in his life. So the first myth is that Boston 2024 would have fixed the MBTA. The reality is that in Boston 2024's multi-billion-dollar budget, not a single penny went to fixing the MBTA. So what they were saying is that, yes, we would maybe need to make some upgrades in the system, but they weren't proposing to grow the pie at all. There was no new money. It was just cutting a bigger slice for themselves at the expense of other important projects. Here's one way to think about that. You'll all remember the winter of 2015 and the fact that the MBTA shut down for a number of days. One of the issues with that were switch heaters. That's a piece of infrastructure that basically keeps the switch between rail lines warm so that it can continue to move in the winter and not get frozen up. Boston 2024 was never going to advocate for investments in switch heaters because they were hosting the games in the summer. They didn't care about what was going to happen in the winter. So here's myth number 2, that this would have meant infrastructure improvements around the state beyond just the MBTA. In fact, if you looked at Boston 2024's suggested projects, every single one of them was within 128. And so other voters and other communities would not have benefited in any way from any sort of investment. Myth number 3 is that Boston 2024 would have been an economic boon for Massachusetts. They worked with the Boston Foundation secretly. They gave the Boston Foundation access to that same report that you saw circled in that photo earlier before the press had it. And the Boston Foundation put together this glowing report or study that found that there would be multiple billions of dollars of positive benefit. But if you put that in the context of the Massachusetts economy, they found that it was actually less than 1% in terms of a boost to the economy over the course of the 2017 to 2024 time period where most of the construction would occur. And most importantly, the focus here was always on construction, right? So if you went through that report and you did a Control F to find the number of times the word construction showed up, it was something like 120 times. The words healthcare didn't show up once. The words education didn't show up once. Those are actually the drivers of our economy in Massachusetts, and yet they would have received no investment at all or no benefit at all from Boston 2024. The next myth is that we didn't really have to build any new venues. We were going to use some of our beautiful existing venues, whether that's Fenway Park or Harvard Stadium or the Charles River. In fact, Boston 2024 was proposing to build the 3 most expensive Olympic venues in addition to building an Olympic Village. Here's what happened in London. In London, they thought the Olympic Stadium was going to cost $423 million. In fact, it cost $1.1 billion. They thought the Aquatic Center would be $113 million. It actually cost $404 million. And they thought that the Velodrome would cost $30 million. And in fact, it was over $150 million. If you look at Boston 2024's estimates, they're clearly lowball estimates in the same way that London produced lowball estimates. And so you would have seen these same overruns on the order of magnitude of $1 billion or more just for the sporting venues alone. The next myth that was often talked about by Boston 2024 is that games that are held in the United States are profitable. It's only countries like Greece or countries like Brazil that have major cost overruns and waste all their money. When it's in the US, they say, well, it's profitable. In fact, the evidence is that every Olympic Games from 1960 on has had a cost overrun. That is to say, every Olympic Games for which there's data. Sometimes the organizers destroy the data, like in Japan when they had the Winter Olympics there. They immediately threw all of the files of the organizing committee literally into a fire, into a furnace to cover up any of the cost overruns that they had. If you look at places like Lake Placid, they had significant cost overruns and they required a bailout from the New York State government just to be able to keep those venues in place. And the interesting thing for us is that, and we talk about this in the book, that the leaders of Boston 2024 would go on radio and on television and they would say Lake Placid had a surplus. Lake Placid was a profitable games. All you had to do was Google Lake Placid deficit, and the first article that came up was a New York Times article from 1981 that said there were major cost overruns and major deficits. So there's some mythology there that has sort of infiltrated the USOC more broadly. They use it as a talking point, but it's just simply not true. The one exception to that rule is probably Los Angeles in 1984, and we'll talk a little bit more about why they were such an exception. The next myth was that insurance was going to somehow cover the cost overruns. So the public would never have to deal with the cost overruns, that they would get insurance companies and buy insurance premiums to do that, or policies to do that. In fact, there's no such thing as an insurance policy for a cost overrun. It doesn't exist. If it did exist, the next time you renovated your house, you would buy that insurance. But it doesn't exist because what happens is that the owners of these facilities and the builders have incentives. If they have that insurance, they have incentives for those costs to go up if they're not paying that marginal dollar. And so insurance companies don't issue these policies. They can't issue these policies. And Boston 2024 was just making it up. You can buy insurance for things like an earthquake or a hurricane, some of the things that are low probability and outside of your control, but you cannot buy insurance for things that are high probability and inside of your control. And a cost overrun is both of those things. The next myth is that the International Olympic Committee is somehow running a competition to see what's the best city or what's the best bid, and that winning city is a victor in a race, as if they were in a 100-yard dash, and whoever's fastest is going to win. In fact, what the IOC is doing is they're running an auction. And they're sitting up at the podium just like this with a big gavel, and they're trying to get as many cities as possible into a room like this one, and they want a bidding frenzy. And as they bid up that price, they get games that are better for the IOC, even if that's at the expense of the folks at home that are actually paying the bill. So they're looking for things like, who's going to build us the fanciest stadium, who's going to build us the nicest Olympic village, and importantly, which of these cities is going to look best on television. Because what the IOC cares about more than anything else is what looks good on television. They get billions of dollars every cycle from television contracts. And they want NBC and the BBC and CBC, all these stations, to be happy with what their viewers are seeing. And we think that's really why the USOC chose Boston over Los Angeles. One is that we're a beautiful city on television, and you could see from that image, the drone or helicopter shot over our city. But the second and more important reason is that we are on the East Coast time zone, which is the single most valuable time zone in the world. When you have live television events on the East Coast, they're still able to watch it on the West Coast. A 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock event is still after work on the West Coast. And at the same time, it's not too late for the folks in Western Europe to also stay up. So if we had maybe a 7 o'clock opening ceremonies or a 6 o'clock opening ceremonies, you can still watch that if you stay up late in the UK or in France. So ultimately, this is about an auction. It's about what's best for the IOC, and often that's at the expense of what's best for the host city. The next myth is that the IOC has somehow changed or somehow reformed. And I know the text on this slide is hard to see, but they talked about something called Agenda 2020, which was their effort to, they say, reduce the cost of bidding and create an environment where cities can produce bids that are good for the host city and not just good for the IOC. So this is a list of 40 reforms. 2020 is a play on words. It's for perfect vision. It's for a vision that would be in place by 2020. And it's for the 40 reforms, 20 plus 20 reforms that they wrote and voted on. In fact, of those 40 reforms, just 7 of them actually dealt with host cities. And the other 33 were things about doping and about television contracts. There's something in there about the Olympic Museum, not stuff that's really that relevant to host cities. And when you dug in on that language, what you saw is that, for example, one of the reforms was, instead of having to physically deliver your bid book, similar to what you saw in that prior image, so instead of sending them on a plane or sending them by FedEx, you could now email it in. You could now send it digitally. That might be a savings of, $1,000, $500 on bids that typically total more than $70 million just for the bidding process alone. So these are hardly significant, meaningful savings from the IOC. It's much more window dressing than anything else. The next myth was that Boston 2024 was actually a really good idea, and the organizers just did a poor job of marketing it. They just didn't do a good job of getting their message out. In fact, they had really good marketing. They had sports stars like Meb Keflezighi and David Ortiz and Larry Bird, who were members of their board of directors and were going on television talking about how good this bid would be. They had the best marketers in all of Boston and all the country working on the bid, the best political consultants and communications consultants. So it was not a lack of effort or a lack of skill in terms of their ability to communicate. It was much more about the fundamentals of the bid, and that became clear as time went on. And this is the final myth, which is that Boston 2024 would have been more popular if it just had more time to explain its plan. And if people hadn't just, if the naysayers hadn't just jumped on this out of the gate, that somehow Boston 2024 would have been able to tell its story. But in fact, really the opposite was true. So Bostonians are actually a very open and receptive bunch. Every September, we welcome people from around the world to come to our universities, and we're glad that they come to our city. Every April, we welcome athletes to the Boston Marathon from around the world, and we're so proud that they choose to run in Boston. So we're very open to the idea of welcoming the world and having big sporting events. And that's what the polling showed. In January of 2015, this bid was a popular bid. More than 50% of the public agreed that the bid was a good idea, and only about 35% of the public thought it was a bad idea. So we were open to the idea, but what happened is that as Bostonians learned more about the bid, they liked the bid less. And that really occurred over the course of January, February, and March. By March, we had flipped those numbers so that more than half of the public was now opposed to the bid, and about 35 or 36% of the public supported the bid in Greater Boston. And what you saw was really fascinating. It really was about education and information. So when you asked voters first, how closely have you been following the Olympic bid? The folks that had been following it not at all, they said, I haven't really been following it. I heard about it, but I haven't really been following about it. The polling found that that group of people supported the bid at over 50%, even in March. The group that said, I've been following it closely, I've been reading a lot about it, I'm informed on this issue, that group supported it in the 20s. And so our job as No Boston Olympics was to work on education and information, to push more and more people from uninformed or underinformed into the categories of informed and aware that there was some fine print on this contract that needed to be signed, that their taxpayers had to cover cost overruns, that there were venues that needed to be built, that prior Olympic Games in the US had cost overruns, that this was an auction and not a race. And as we got Bostonians to think about that and talk about that with the help of the media, we're able to push more and more folks towards opposition. So that's all great, and that talks about, that's a discussion of sort of how we won, but why is this important enough to write a book about? Why did we want to share this story with the world? And I don't think I've mentioned my co-author, who's Andrew Zimbalist, who is a professor at Smith College, long tenured professor of economics. This was book number 27 for him, and book number 1 for me. Why did we want to write about this? And we decided to write about this book while we were in, of all places, Hamburg, Germany. This is a photo of Andy and I sharing a beer at a hotel bar in Hamburg, Germany. We found ourselves there in October of 2015, and we had both been invited independently by different groups in Hamburg to talk about why Boston had rejected the games. Because Hamburg was considering its own bid. It was putting its own bid forward for the 2024 Olympics, just like Boston. And in fact, there's a lot of similarities between Boston and Hamburg. They're both these northern port cities and industrial cities that have successfully transitioned to the knowledge economy and an educated economy. Strong economics overall. In fact, Hamburg is one of the wealthiest cities in all of Germany, just as Boston is in the United States. And so they had a bid going, pushed by many of the same folks in Hamburg that were pushing it in Boston, members of the Chamber of Commerce, some influential politicians. And they had a very compelling vision for Hamburg too. Does this look kind of familiar? We've got, a port city, we've got a beautiful skyline and neighborhoods, and then we've got this gleaming new stadium in the middle of it all, at the center of things. They don't have any fireworks. I guess they didn't have any budget for that. Boston had fireworks and tall ships. But this is sort of the image that Hamburg was trying to present. In Hamburg, we knew that in November there was going to be a vote. And so part of what we were doing in Hamburg was helping the opponents understand what the most compelling arguments were. And in fact, in November of that year, just about a month after we were there, by a pretty narrow margin, but still successful, the voters of Hamburg voted down the bid. The polling had been supportive in the 60s, but in fact, when they put it to a vote, it was something like 52% opposition and 48% support. And that was a real blow to the International Olympic Committee, because the IOC's president is a guy named Thomas Bach, who used to be the head of the German Olympic Committee. So this was going to be sort of his hometown bid. And it was an embarrassment for him that it didn't pass. But it's not just Hamburg. A few months after Hamburg said no, there was a discussion in Rome about advancing a bid in Rome. And a lot of the same folks from the Chamber of Commerce and some of the powerful politicians in Rome were pushing this bid. They were talking about how it would put Rome on the world stage, as if Rome is not already on the world stage. And thankfully in Rome, they had a mayoral election between the submission of the bid and when the IOC was actually going to decide. And there was an outsider candidate who ran for mayor on a platform of, I don't support the bid, and I think we have other priorities for our city, like fixing the trash collection system, repaving streets, fixing our schools. Those are the things we should focus on instead of the Olympic bid. This is what she looks like. I know it's kind of incredible, but this is the mayor of Rome, a total knockout. And she was opposed to the bid. I think she was, in her late 30s at the time, running against longtime politicians. But she won. And a few months after she won, she brought the city council together and she said, I ran on this platform, we opposed the bid, and the city council deferred to her. And the bid was dropped in Rome. And then there's Budapest. So Budapest was also considering a bid backed by very powerful politicians, including the Prime Minister of Hungary and the Chamber of Commerce in Budapest. They were pushing a bid. Now they have a similar stadium shot to Hamburg and Boston. I don't know why they didn't zoom out and show the river and the Parliament building, but this was their image of what the Olympic Stadium could look like in Budapest. And thankfully in Budapest, there was a group of upstart citizens. In fact, they were students in their 20s. And they said this is not what they want for their future. They don't want mega events and construction of big stadiums. They want to focus on the environment and they want to focus on schools and quality of life in the city of Budapest. And pretty heroically, these folks who, like us, were underfunded, didn't have any formal structure, they collected 266,000 signatures from the residents of Budapest. This is them delivering the boxes of signatures. And they forced a referendum, which the proponents of the bid never thought was possible. They forced a referendum, and the proponents of the bid and the prime minister were so worried that this was becoming a referendum on their leadership that they dropped the bid before the vote could be held, because they feared that they would lose and that it would be even more embarrassing. So this has been the 2024 cycle for the International Olympic Committee. Boston drops out, and then Hamburg, Rome, and Budapest all drop out. And leaders in all three of those cities pointed to Boston and said, Boston made a smart decision, we're going to make the same decision. And the mayor of Rome literally said that in her final speech on the Olympic Games. She said, Boston made the smart decision, Rome should make a smart decision too. So the IOC is now left with two cities for the 2024 Games. One is Paris, which has been bidding throughout the entire process. And the other is Los Angeles, which was substituted in for Boston when Boston dropped its bid in 2015. And the IOC doesn't really like this situation. They don't like having so few bidders in the auction room. You wouldn't want it either if you were running an auction. In fact, the last time this happened, it was really risky for the IOC. Last time this happened was actually in the bidding for the 1984 Games. This is the late 70s. It's after some troubling games in Mexico City and Munich, and then in Montreal, which were, the games there were 10 times over budget. And so in 1977, when it became time to bid for the 1984 Games, there were only two cities that showed up. One was Los Angeles, and the other was Tehran, Iran. And Tehran was on the verge of the Iranian Revolution and dropped out of the bidding. And so that left Los Angeles as the only bidder. And when you show up to an auction and you're the only bidder, you get a really good deal. And so rather than the IOC being able to dictate the terms and say, build us a fancy new stadium, build us a new Olympic village, give us all the upside in terms of revenue, and we want you to take all the risk, Los Angeles said, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it on our terms, not on your terms. And so they rejected the IOC's requirement for a taxpayer guarantee to cover cost overruns. They rejected the IOC's requirement for a new stadium, and they rejected the IOC's requirement for a new Olympic village. And that's really why Los Angeles was successful in 1984. They had much more negotiating leverage over the IOC, and they were able to extract demands from the IOC that other cities typically don't. That's why they were the profitable games. So now we've got two bids, and the IOC is, again, concerned about this because they're worried that if they only award one of the games for 2024, that maybe no one shows up for 2028. And so what you'll hear in the next few months, and this is essentially unprecedented in IOC history, is that the IOC is going to change its rules in the middle of the competition, in the middle of the auction, and they're likely to award the 2024 Games to Paris and then the 2028 Games to Los Angeles at the same time. Even though it says in the Olympic Charter you have to award it 7 games before, they're going to say, look, this is an extraordinary circumstance, and we're going to award it to both cities. And what that's going to do, they hope, is buy the IOC some time to sort of figure out how they can generate more interest in the games and get more bidders back into the auction room, because they want to avoid a situation where it's only 1 or 2 bidders. I want to bring it back to Brookline and the importance of Brookline. I know many of you are from Brookline or have ties to the community. The importance of Brookline in this debate. The issue of the Olympics was brought up to Brookline town meeting, and we had, in a way that only Brookline can really, a really robust debate about whether this would be good or bad for our town. And I have a lot of pride in that process that we took, going through the subcommittee of the advisory committee, and then the advisory committee, and then the board of selectmen, and eventually the town meeting. And when town meeting voted on a resolution to oppose the games in May of 2015, it made international headlines. The Associated Press and the New York Times wrote about Brookline rejecting the games as a sign, another sign, that Bostonians were unhappy with this bid, and that while some powerful people and powerful politicians were pushing it, regular citizens were not happy with this bid. So it's a great example of Brookline town meeting in particular, having impact much more broadly beyond the borders of Brookline. Again, a really proud moment, I think, for our town. But it's not just a proud moment for Brookline, it's a proud moment really for all Bostonians. And this is actually the final words of the book. This is what John Fish, who was the leader of Boston 2024, said to me when he very graciously called the day after the bid was pulled in the summer of 2015. He said, democracy worked. We had a real debate about the pros and cons of the Olympics in Boston, and people decided that it was not a good idea. And the only way we were able to have that debate and get that information out, there's really two reasons. One is the press. And I think a lot of us in this room understand in 2017 that the press is only more important now than it ever was as we deal with all the chaos in Washington. And we're so fortunate to have some of those institutions really looking out for people and sharing information. And that was true in Boston too. We had a dedicated press corps of a lot of really young journalists in their 20s and 30s who were eager to go after these stories, were eager to track down the information and to eventually share it with the public through their publications. So it would not have happened without that. And it also would not have happened without engaged citizens. And there are so many of you in this room who played a role in that process, who showed up at public meetings, who wrote letters to the editor, who talked to their elected officials, who talked to their neighbors and talked about some of the drawbacks of the bid. So I am incredibly grateful to so many of you for being a part of that effort. And I really want to thank you and give yourselves a round of applause for your engagement on that. I certainly will. This really was democracy working. And I think we should have a lot of pride as Brookline residents and Bostonians for what it is that we as a community accomplished, having this debate and then having this debate really reverberate around the world to other cities that are saying no. I'll close with that, but I do need to say some thank yous. So first to Andy Zimbalist, even though he's not here. He was such an important part of the intellectual background of our efforts with No Boston Olympics, and then also, of course, in writing the book and taking a chance on a rookie co-author, and working with me on the book. It was really great to do that with him. I have to thank my parents who are here, and the reason that many of you are here. So thank you to my parents. They are my model for civic participation and why I got involved in this effort. And then thank my girlfriend Anna, who's here, who was incredibly patient throughout the course of this debate and was willing to put up with a lot of me being distracted and me being obsessed with this issue, especially for those 200 days between the USOC decision and when the bid was dropped. But then also in the writing of the book, when that was also taking me away from her. So thank you, Anna, for all of your patience and love. With that, I would love to turn it over for questions. And again, thank you all for being here and for your engagement on this issue. It's great to have so many folks here, and I look forward to hearing your stories and your questions and anything else. Thank you. Yep.
Did you think that Marty Walsh was disingenuous, or what's the reason for him not to consider what's best for Boston? Do you have a sense of how he conceptualized it?
Yeah, we talk about this in the book a little bit. I will. Sure. So the question was, sort of what was Mayor Walsh's motivations? Why was he pushing the bid so strongly when it seems like there are some real apparent drawbacks? I think we have to give him some credit that his heart is and was in the right place. And he just felt like this was a good thing for the city, despite some of these drawbacks. We talk about this in the book a little bit. I mean, I think it's, for him, it was an attractive idea in the wake of the election in 2013 when he was elected. Frankly, with some skepticism from the business community. You'll remember that a lot of the business community was behind his opponent, John Connolly. And the fact that early in his tenure, members of the business community came to him with this proposal was, I think, a way to sort of protect his flank a little bit politically and to build a bridge to the business community that wasn't there. Remember that John Fish, who was the leader behind this bid, was also the incoming chair of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. So you kind of check that box, like, okay, I'm good with the Chamber of Commerce now if I support this bid. I also think that it would have been very popular ultimately with his more traditional kind of building trades labor base. The Boston 2024 boosters said that every single job would be a union job. And so I think it was good for his base. I think it helped build a relationship with people that were maybe a little skeptical of him. And I also think he's a sports fan, having talked to him about this. I mean, I think he's watched the Olympics a lot himself, and the idea of sort of having Boston as the center of the world's attention and having all these athletes in our city was something that was really attractive to him. Yep. Let's do Tommy. Yep.
So when people started talking about the Olympics in Boston, of course, everyone dreamed their Olympics, right? We're going to fix the T, and we're going to get we're going to get a soccer stadium downtown for the revolution, and we're going to get better. We're going to get some middle class housing out of the village. Something.
Yeah.
Right? These visions. Is it imaginable, maybe after LA in 2028 and 2032, is it imaginable that a city could put together a bid that really does move forward for the city and still balance the books for the IOC? Is that dream a possible reality, or is it always going to be fantasy?
So the question is about, is there a bid that could have worked for Boston or could work for other cities that care about things like more housing and more investment in transit? We really think that that this is a fiction, and that frankly cities are much better off focusing on their core priorities. I think you don't get housing and an improved T through a bank shot. You don't say, hey, we're going to do this really fancy, expensive, complicated thing over here and hope that it improves the T. The way you fix the T is you invest in the T, and you hire good people to run the T, and you make it a center of your public policy, not a nice to have auxiliary piece of your public policy. We talk a lot about something that we call the booster's dilemma, which is that the folks that are pushing the bid get caught in the middle between the IOC on one hand and the taxpayers and citizens at home on the other hand. And this is only true when you've got that vibrant democracy and you've got opposition groups and you have the press calling out questions on this. But there's things like the taxpayer guarantee that threaten to take public resources away from the MBTA, away from housing, and instead put them into a velodrome and a stadium, or other events and festivities associated with the games. There's things like the Olympic Village, right, where you talk about land that might be available for an Olympic Village. If that land is available to build an Olympic Village, let's build housing there now. Let's not wait 7 years to build an Olympic Village that's spec'd out to the IOC's criteria, and then try to retrofit it for housing for the middle class or workforce housing. So we think it's better to just focus on the basics and the fundamentals, and that the Olympics can be a very costly distraction, not just from a resource perspective, but also from the opportunity cost of your mayor and your governor are spending all this time on questions like, who's going to be the torchbearer for the Olympic ceremonies, and how many seats are we going to have, and how are we going to fill up these luxury boxes. I don't want my mayor and my governor focused on those questions. I want them focused on the much more fundamental questions, which are the ones that get lost, we think, in an Olympic bid. Ma'am, right here. Yep.
This is a great David versus Goliath story. So I'd like to know what kinds of personal characteristics and strokes of luck you had to bring it from a nobody's heard of you to a viable project.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things there. One is that we formed the group knowing that there was going to be very little institutional opposition to this bid. There are a number of organizations that are self-proclaimed sort of watchdogs, like taxpayer watchdogs in the city and at the state level. And frankly, most of the time, I think they do a pretty good job of asking questions around big proposals like this. The challenge for those groups in this situation was that many of their board members were also members of Boston 2024. So you look at like the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, which is an organization that is often calling the question on things like this. On their board is Suffolk Construction, right? Same is true of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. So they were just not positioned to be opponents. They were really going to kind of stay quiet on this one. And so we knew that opposition was going to have to come from the grassroots, and we thought that we were well positioned. And there were 3 co-founders who had all worked in government and worked on political campaigns, and so we felt like we might be able to get that story out. We were very fortunate to have a press that was interested in telling both sides of the story. So every time that Boston 2024 put out a press release that talked about how great the Olympics would be, someone at the Boston Globe and the Herald and WBUR would say, okay, well, that's one side of the story. Who's going to tell the other side? And we had a website and a Twitter account. They could go to us and they could call us up or email us and say, what are your thoughts on this? And so that actually elevated us in the debate. Every time that Boston 2024 put out a press release, we were all of a sudden quoted and we looked like equals.
Publicity came from the press and social media.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't spend a single dollar on publicity. So it was all media driven and social media driven. I think I wouldn't attribute what we did to personal characteristics other than to say this. I think it was the 3 co-founders and 3 co-chairs were all in their early 30s. And I think that I think we were able to do this because we were in sort of a unique time in our life where we were old enough to have, I think, enough experience to know what we were doing and to have just the background to be effective. But we weren't so old that we had mortgages and, kids and all these other things that make you much, much more risk averse. I spent 6 months unpaid in 2015 fighting this bid, and I was only able to do that because I live in a little tiny apartment in Brookline Village and I don't have a mortgage and I don't have kids. If I had had those things, I would not have had the luxury of doing that. And so I think it was a unique time in our lives where we had the flexibility to go about that work and have it pay off. Yep. Nomi.
You've been praising the media, and I did see mostly a lot of good coverage for the Boston Olympics, but it seemed to me that there were a couple of people at the Globe who had it out for you guys.
Yeah.
How did you sort of navigate that when the Globe is basically the local paper of record?
Yeah. So the Globe was really hard for us. We felt certainly at times that they were trying to boost the profile of Boston 2024 and trying to tell that story. It was often true, and I agree with you that they're the paper of record. It was often true that Boston 2024 would give information to the Globe before other news outlets. So an example of that is that Boston Foundation report that I talked about that showed something like, $7 billion of economic benefit. They gave that to the Globe first. So that was the front page of the Globe the next day, and then everyone else kind of reported on it after and became publicly available the next day. So there was a symbiotic relationship between Boston 2024 and the Globe. At the same time, I do think that they asked some tough questions of the bid at the right time. And then I think probably most important for us were that there were some great columnists. People like Scott Lehigh and Joan Vanocchi and Yvonne Abraham, who are powerful voices in the Globe and who I think all appreciate an underdog and all feel like it's part of their job when other institutions aren't stepping up, that they sort of step up and ask some tough questions. And so, for every columnist that we felt like was in the tank, there were 3 or 4 that were willing to ask those hard questions, and it all kind of balanced out in the end. Yep. Yeah.
So obviously Mayor Walsh, he was an avid supporter of this bid for a while.
Yep.
And his re-election is coming up. Do you think his outspoken support has hurt his re-election bid?
I think the defeat of Boston 2024 was a really good thing for his campaign in the end. And if you think about it, if the bid hadn't died and it were still going on now, and we were still having this pro and con debate, and he was still as forceful a supporter as he was, I think that his challengers would have a much bigger platform and have a much greater chance of potentially beating him, or at least being competitive. So my guess, I haven't asked him about this, I haven't talked to him about this, but my guess is that in hindsight, he's pretty happy that the bid died and it's not a part of the campaign right now. I think the defeat happened early enough. It's a good almost 2 years ago now, that people's memories are pretty short, and that for the most part, a lot of people have kind of moved on from that. Not everyone, but some people. Yeah. Right here. Yeah.
You're very generous when you talk about the IOC. So I'm an anti-nuclear activist, and you know where I'm going next, right, to Japan.
Yeah.
And we call the IOC like a corrupt cabal.
Yeah.
And we say worse about Shinzo Abe, who is now Trump's best friend forever.
Yeah.
And there is a group internationally trying to stop the Olympics in Japan 2020.
Yep.
So I came here to hear you and to ask you, we need some help.
Sure. So the question is on opposing the Tokyo 2020 games, which are the next Summer Olympics. And there's all sorts of geopolitical concerns around that, and nuclear concerns.
It's Fukushima we're talking.
Yeah. Yep. So we've had some connection with some of the folks in Japan. A Japanese journalist told me that when we wrote this book, we'd sell 1 million copies in Japan. I haven't seen any of those sales yet, but I'm still hoping for them.
Translated?
Not yet, but if you can do it, we'd be glad to do it. So I think it's once these things get going, they're really hard to stop. And I don't know that it's frankly realistic to say that the games won't go on in Japan. I do think it's important that both sides of the story in Japan are told, because what the Japanese government wanted to do is say, this is a huge success and we pulled it off and it was great. They're already, 3 years out, they're already multiple billions of dollars over budget on the bid. So it's already been a really troubling thing for them. And I think that's only going to get worse over time.
But where we're coming from is saying that our athletes, the best athletes in the world, should not be going to Japan because the entire country is radiated.
Yeah.
And they are talking about having some events even in the Fukushima prefecture.
Yeah.
And people don't know that. Probably nobody in this
Yeah.
room knows this. So what you're saying is like what you folks did, it's an
Yeah.
educational thing.
Yeah.
And I'm liking to tilt at windmills. I'm not,
Yeah.
we're not saying it's too short.
Yeah. Well, I'd be happy to talk with you after about how we can help.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, sir.
So I wanted to follow up actually on what Tommy was talking about, in that, are the Olympics flawed? I mean, there's certainly a lot of popularity in terms of the TV audience.
Yep.
And do you feel like there's a model for how this can work and not be destructive? I don't know whether that's that it needs a permanent location and not keep rebuilding everything, or but do you think that the Olympics are just fundamentally flawed and we should do away with them, or do you think there's a solution?
So we talk about this in the book. The question is the Olympic model fundamentally flawed? Or is there some way we can change it to make it better? Or sort of how do we think about it moving forward? Because I don't think anyone is opposed to the idea of the Olympics. We like the fact that athletes can come together and compete on the playing field and not the battlefield. And so there's benefit there for sure. The modern Olympic model was really created for the 1896 Games in Athens, Greece. And it won't surprise you that in 1896 there were major cost overruns on the Olympic Stadium. And the king of Greece actually pleaded with the IOC and said, we've built all this stuff, we spent way more on it than we were expecting to. Please let us be the permanent host of the Olympics. We can host it every 4 years. But the founder of the IOC, Pierre de Coubertin, he was a Parisian, and he wanted to see the games in his hometown because this was his dream and his baby. And so he insisted that they move to Paris and then on to other cities, St. Louis in 1904. And the model there was really the World's Fair model, which was another invention of the 19th century. And the idea is, look, at that time, to get between two cities, you might need to do a 2 or 3 week ocean voyage. And so the only way you were going to be able to share this experience with the world was to rotate it around. But since 1896, we've invented the radio, the television, the internet, air travel. There are now a lot more ways to share the Olympics with the world, but the IOC is sort of clinging to this 19th century model that they have to move things around. And I think you could make a very compelling case that a permanent location or a small number of permanent locations would be a much better model for the IOC. It would still retain all of the magic of the Olympics and all of the glamour of the Olympics, but do it in a much more efficient and effective way. Unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic that the IOC will choose to do that, because today the IOC, which is, by the way, it's roughly 100 people, a lot of them are self-appointed, they're members of royalty. It's people like the Princess of Liechtenstein, the Prince of Monaco, the Prince of Malaysia, there's a sheikh from Kuwait who's on the IOC. There are more IOC voters from Liechtenstein than from the entire state of Massachusetts, right? Liechtenstein has a population of about 35,000 people. So they don't really want to change. They're used to getting their way. And they also have a pretty easy job right now, which is running an auction every 2 years. That's a relatively easy thing to do. If you make it a permanent location, either they have to take responsibility for actually putting on the event, which is way harder than just running an auction, or they have to cede control of running the event to the host city. And that means they're giving up their control to the city fathers and mothers in Los Angeles or Paris or London. And they don't want to do that either, because they want to have all the control. So I think we're sort of stuck, unfortunately, in this model. And I think if you're a city, the best game to play here is just to stay out of the game entirely and not try to change the IOC. I just don't think that cities are going to have a lot of ability to impact that, unfortunately. It's sad, but it's sort of where we are.
Chris,
Yep.
two points. One, I personally think that the Olympics is a farce, in the sense that we have the NBA, okay, and we have Major League Baseball, and we have the National Hockey League as one or three institutions that are professional and use that to make money, and those same players then go to the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, I don't see any value in putting Michael Jordan, okay? So anyway, but that's just a point.
Yep.
In terms of Boston, and comparing Boston to what happened in London, comparing Boston to what happened in Rio de Janeiro in terms of displacing poor people,
Yep.
what would have happened in Boston in terms of the Olympic villages expanding and displacing? You know they weren't going to displace people in Brookline.
Yep.
Okay? Who was going to be at the back end of that,
So,
in your estimation?
Sure. So unfortunately, there's a really sad history of people being displaced for the creation of Olympic venues. In Beijing, for example, the estimate is it's something like 500,000 people were forced to move from their homes to build the Olympic village, or the Olympic area with the stadium and the aquatic center and the village. In Brazil, thankfully, with some independent journalism, we saw some of the images of people literally trying to hold on to their homes as they were being pulled off of them, and bulldozers were knocking them over. And the sad part about that is, as far as I can tell, they didn't actually need that space. It was a village of maybe, or neighborhood of maybe, 5,000 people or 7,000 people. They didn't need that space for anything other than parking tour buses that were bringing tourists to the venues. And in fact, it was probably more about clearing out the favela so that it didn't look bad on television. It didn't look bad in the shot of the NBC or the BBC would have. So you get some really unfortunate and unfair and unjust decisions there. In Boston, I do think that there would have been minimal residential displacement in terms of forcing people out of their homes. There would have been some commercial displacement, the taking of property that's currently commercially owned to build some of these venues. And that was often done without any input from the business owners. In fact, in the bid documents, again, that secret document that had all these errors in it, they said in that document that they were negotiating with one of the real estate owners who who owned a site where the Olympic Village would be. And it showed up in the bid that that's what they were doing. It turns out that the Dorchester Reporter, which is a local newspaper in Dorchester, was located in the building that was slated for the taking. And they called up their landlord and they said, have you heard anything about this? Are you negotiating with the Olympics to sell your building, to sell the building that we're located in? And the landlord said, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard from these guys. But they had written it into the bid because they were trying to convince the USOC that they were further along in the process than they actually were. Arthur, I think it's a great question, and I think we'll never really know sort of what the impact would have been, but we know that there are commercial property owners and others that would have, and some folks in the wholesale food industry at Widett Circle that would have been forced to relocate and wouldn't have had much choice about that. Let me take one more question if there is one. I know it's hot down here. Yep, up front.
One thing that always bothered me is afterwards everyone said John Fish was so great, he was gracious to you. I mean, all the things you're saying, they lied, and they knew they were lying in this bid, and he's still considered the most powerful guy, and isn't he terrific? And well, he tried and it didn't work. These guys lied.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like nobody's taking any responsibility for that. That's not something that's being remembered.
Yeah.
It goes beyond disingenuous.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I think that a lot of the boosters were willing to play fast and loose with the truth, and willing to get in front of the public and to say that things were not as they seemed to be, or things were different. And I mean, they could have Googled some of this stuff and found out that what they were saying was wrong. So you may even give them the benefit of the doubt that they just were poorly informed by their staff members. But it would have been pretty simple to correct some of these things, and they seem to have no issue with going in front of the public and repeating these misstatements. And that's unfortunate, but I think the bright side of that is that given the grassroots effort that we and others were a part of, and given really good journalism, we were able to sort of call people out for those misstatements, and that ultimately we think truth won out here.
The last thing that
yeah.
I read several articles that said what you did became like a case study. So many places they said it was so unusual for just a few people to actually go against the big powers and to win. They said it was just, and he's being very modest. I mean, he has this amazing resume that helped. I mean, you were very savvy, you and your other two, but especially you're very savvy. But I read that it's very unusual for the little guy to be able to go against these powers.
Yeah.
He did it.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks. Wow. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Really hope you enjoy the book, and thanks for being a part of this entire experience.